Alright, welcome back, 93% men and 7% ladies. I thought of a project name for this, and I think we're going to call him Tim. And Tim stands for Trust Issues Mustang. If you're just getting caught up, this car has some issues that we're going to fix and get it back out to the owner. So essentially I'm going to be doing kind of like a revamp on the whole thing. I'm going to work on pulling the turbo kit and stuff off today. I'm going to pull the motor and trans out. I have the intake flipped up like that because in the last video I did pressure test the injectors to make sure they're not leaking because I was finding fuel in the oil. I did have a suggestion in the comments from Scrap Metal Sleepers to actually plug in the injector harness and then pressure test it, because sometimes you can actually have issues with the injector drivers and the ECU applying power when they don't need power. So I did that off camera, plugged the injector harness in, retested it, still didn't leak. So at least that's a good sign. It's actually a really nice looking car and should be a good project, so subscribe to the channel, stick around for the build. Then while I was tinkering around a little bit more, I did actually notice that motor plate is bent. So the mount that it's bolted to down here is actually kind of bent, so I think that's twisting the whole plate. It's extremely close to the firewall. The back of the intake was like really hard to get to. And the head down here is like almost touching the firewall. So everything's super close. Doesn't really need to be that close. We got plenty of room up here. So I talked to the owner. He's okay with me taking the motor plate off and rebuilding some mounts. It is going to be mostly a daily like street driver anyways. A regular set of mounts with poly bushings will be a little bit better for street driving anyways. And then we'll be able to push the motor forward a little bit. We already know we have to do the drive shaft because the drive shaft is too short and it has to be redone anyways. So that's not really holding us back from just moving the motor forward a little bit. The challenge is going to be the oil pan on the K-member. It is a stock K-member. So I'll probably have to notch that out a little bit, which isn't a big deal. So next I'll be draining the fluid, see how much fluid we get out of it. I was able to confirm that the yoke on the transmission is actually the wrong style yoke. So essentially when the drive shaft was measured, it was not fully seated in the trans already, and then it was pulled out 1 inch. So that's why it looks like it's sticking out too far. The Turbo 400 actually has two style output shafts. One is a bolt-on output shaft and one doesn't have a bolt-on style yoke. And one is wider than the other one and it has an O-ring groove on it, and the other style doesn't have an O-ring groove. So the yoke that's on there now is a fully splined yoke. And look at my old Ranger drive shaft here. You can see the splines go all the way to the end of the yoke. And the fully splined yoke should be on the output shaft that doesn't have the O-ring groove. And the style with the O-ring groove on it should have a counterbore yoke. And this is a 350Z drive shaft, but you can see how it has a smooth spot on the inside. The splines aren't all the way to the end. So that's a counterbore yoke. So what that counterbore does is allows the slip yoke to go over the wider diameter O-ring groove section. And then you can fully seat the yoke onto the shaft. Once it's fully seated, then you can measure for your 1 inch pullout. So this one was fully splined, so it already wasn't fully seated, and then it was pulled out another inch for the measurement on the drive shaft. It's a pretty common mistake, especially with the Turbo 400s, because there is the two different style output shafts, so just something to keep in mind. All right, so I'll go ahead and get this intake off. If I was smart, I would have actually took this thing off a couple days ago, because now I'm going to have some fuel spill out. Yeah, so we're basically going to be redoing most of the fuel lines. There's some short sections and stuff we might be able to keep and reuse. We'll be reusing some of the fittings. The fittings and stuff are relatively new. This car was put together like less than a year ago. The main issue with the lines is really the routing, and some of them are damaged. And some of the stuff we just kind of want to keep the cost down for the guy. So, because remember, he brought this in for a dyno tune and ended up having to redo most of it. So kind of unexpected for him. So we're going to keep the cost down where we can, but make it a little bit safer and a little bit stronger too, because we're doing subframe connectors. We're going to do the torque boxes. The car does have a trans brake in it and twin turbos and 3 fuel pumps. So it has dual 450s and a 225. So there's no reason that this thing shouldn't make a decent amount of power, especially with the trans brake. So we want to stiffen up the rear end and do the subframe connectors. So it should be a really sweet project, actually. All right, so I got this catch can off. Ready for it? Yeah, that was just all fuel. All right, so draining the fluid. Fluid is like a nice red color, so it actually looks really good, which is a good sign. Probably won't have to go through the transmission. And this is a clean tub, so I should be able to reuse the fluid. And it's a 15 quart tub. So, and it looks like it's more than a third full already. So I got at least 5 quarts out of it. So it should have been full, or at least it looks like it has plenty of fluid in it. So just to clarify, I'm not saying that the transmission needs 5 quarts. I'm saying at least 5 quarts came out of it. Just draining the pan. Usually you want to see like 5.5 to 6 quarts at least on a pan drop that come out of it. So like in that situation, if I drained it and I only got 2 quarts out of it, there's a good chance it was actually low on fluid. But on a fresh fill, on a fresh rebuild, it'll need a lot more than 5 quarts because you got to fill the converter and fill all the drums and all the lines and everything. So it seems like I got enough out of it just draining it that it doesn't seem like it was low. So what I'll do is I'll let this sit in the bin for a day and let everything settle. Then I'll throw it back into a clean bottle and then we should be able to reuse it. I'll let it settle and then I'll pour it back out, check it, make sure there's nothing in the bottom that's weird. Looks really clean, so that's a good sign. Don't have any reason to believe that the transmission got hot or was slipping or anything like that. So one less thing we should have to worry about with this thing and shouldn't have to drop the pan or anything. Then we can just kind of focus on other stuff. So I'll go underneath, get the drive shaft out, and we start getting the turbo kit off. And then maybe even get the engine out today. All right, so there's the drive shaft yoke. You can see kind of where the end seal was. From here to here is probably where it's sliding in and out when it slips. So you really have maybe like an inch and a half of spline contact on the output shaft. So really that should be like another inch longer and then have probably another almost an inch of overlap from the counterbore. Or this would be counterbored and then just pushed in farther. Another thing about this shaft I'll probably change is the rear U-joint. So you can see that this one is a non-greasable style and then this one actually has the grease zerk in it. So these ones with the grease zerks in them are a little bit weaker. Well, the front one has a solid piece all the way through. This one has lube channels inside of it, so it's actually hollow in the middle of it because it has to push the grease from the center all the way out to the outside. So the middle of the U-joint actually has channels drilled all the way through it. So it's actually just in general a weaker joint. So I'll probably change that one out, make sure we have 2 solid ones in there. All right, so now I think I'll pull the radiator and stuff out, drain the fluid. Okay, so I took all the radiator hoses off. So this is one of the lower radiator hoses. Some of them don't have barbs on them, so that's not a good thing either. Get a little bit of pressure in that system, those things could pop off pretty easy. All right, so these are all unbolted. I have the oil lines off. I should just be able to take these out now. Cancel. Remove the vacuum line down by the wastegate, but it must be zip tied. I'm just gonna cut it. All right, got one off. Both the gaskets actually looked good. I don't think this thing saw very much power yet, but I usually don't use those. As long as the flanges aren't warped, they usually bolt together pretty well. Little thin layer of RTV in there does wonders. Alright. I was able to verify too that the alignment and stuff is off. Along with the motor plate being bent on this side, it's also separated away from the head. So I'm guessing once you get the motor out and relieve some weight off of it, that these accessories might actually be loose. This idler pulley is actually, and you can see some of the belt material getting ripped off. So the alignment is definitely off. But man, that was a mess getting the radiator hoses off because the radiator has a broken drain fitting. So I ended up just having to pop the lower hose off, and that's always a mess. I'm gonna figure out what size this V-band is. Go ahead and loosen up the V-band here and get this other section off. I do kind of like that the flanges were nice and flat, where I was able to take all the bolts out and just kind of rest that whole thing on there. That was nice that they weren't wanting to fall off, but we'll see how we do it on the next one. I think I'm going to put the turbos in a different spot. I want to see if I can get them to... Let's see if I can get them maybe facing forward a little bit and then try to have a straight path with the exhaust. So we'll see. I've done it a couple different ways. I've done one the same way that the turbos were on this setup, where the exhaust kind of did a 180 and then out the bumper. My 350Z had the turbos facing in, and then the exhaust was able to come down on the outside. downside there is then you're drawing in heat right off of the radiator, but the engine bay is usually pretty hot, so I don't think it makes too much of a difference. Unless you had them facing out far enough where you could actually draw cold air in, but this bay is all sealed off here, so it wasn't doing that. All right, so now that we got this piece off, I'm doing some inspections here. And, well, let's just get a visual of how bad this thing is actually smashed. It's like pretty much smashed all the way through. I don't know if you'll be able to see, but it does still leak there. And I'll take the light off my camera and check this out. I just noticed this. There's no fire ring in the wastegate. So that presents an issue because essentially the fueling for the motor is not correct unless you're under high load, because some of the exhaust gas is actually escaping before it gets to the O2 sensor. So there's very good chance that you're not getting an accurate reading on the O2 sensor and the fueling is off. So now I wonder, now I'm very curious if that was actually overfueling because of the fire ring not being in on that side, and that's where the fuel was coming from. Because there's a chance that fire ring not being in, it's acting like an exhaust leak, which would potentially be reading lean and adding more fuel. Well, I wonder. Oh no, this one might actually have I'll have to pull this apart, see if it actually has a ring in it. All right, moment of truth. Let's see. It's actually missing. Oh, it does have the fire ring. So it must just be smashed in so much. Well, it doesn't make sense either. What am I even saying? If it was smashed in, it would be pushed towards the fire ring. Well, either way, this wastegate is really messed up. It doesn't even touch the fire ring. And it's not even hung up on anything. I could see maybe if the valve was bent and hanging up on the housing, but that's not even the case. So either way, that's a problem. that wastegate not sealing, so that's a good find. So yeah, look at that one. That one's pretty smashed into. You can tell somebody came through afterwards, probably MIG welded this. You can see this little sticks on it, so it must have cracked the weld off because it was originally TIG welded. And then someone came through with a MIG and tried to fix it after it was smashed. It does have these flanges on it that are actually pretty nice. I might try to put these in the lathe and cut this off, put it on the lathe and turn the weld down. And I might try to do that with the turbo flange too, so I don't have to buy new flanges. Because like I said, some areas we want to try to keep the cost down for them. So if I can spend a little bit of time and just turn these down on the lathe and clean them up enough, I'll do that. And that'll probably save them another $100 or something. So yeah, we'll try to do that. Downpipes did have these little bullet mufflers on there, and I actually like the way that this sounds. It's got 2 3-inch downpipes, and I feel like it's just enough to take some of the bite out of the noise, if that makes sense. Where when you pulled it in and I was listening to it run, it still had a nice sound, like nice straight downpipe sound, but it wasn't so loud. I mean, it wasn't muffler quiet. Does that make sense? Do you guys understand what I'm trying to say or not? And there was all the radiator piping. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's like 8 joints on that stuff. I know a couple of them for sure don't have barbs on them. Some of these couplers are actually oversized and they were pinched down on it. So even when I loosened the clamp, they opened up and drained fluid out of them. So they weren't really properly sized anyways. But what I'd like to maybe do is try to get the turbo up in this area and have the downpipe come out this way, where we can leave all of this open and get the hoses to come through there. I'll probably use my little jig that I built for the Ranger to hang the turbos and figure out positions. Next, I'm just going to get this radiator out. I'm going to pull the engine out. It's 4 bolts, and then there's a couple bolts on the transmission mount. I might not video pulling that out. We'll see if I feel like it. Not really super exciting stuff or stuff you guys haven't seen before. If I feel like pulling it out and rambling about it, maybe I'll do that. I'll get some of this other junk off here and figure out what I got to do for mount, so kind of eyeball that. I want to make sure that I have enough room to keep the factory steering shaft and still be able to do a mount. So that'll probably be in the next video, just kind of stripping the thing down, eyeballing it, and then pulling the thing out and trying to get the motor repositioned and mounted back in there. Then we can start building turbo kit and stuff. I'll probably go ahead and take all of the wiring and just pull it all out, drop the gas tank, and get all of the wiring and fuel lines and everything out. And I think it might be better to just see what we have and kind of start fresh on that stuff. And one thing I was looking at too is there's a brake line that's actually in the drive shaft tunnel. It's about 1 inch away from the drive shaft, so I might reroute that brake line too. I'm gonna do a safety loop for it, drive shaft safety loop, but I think it might be a good idea to get that brake line out of the trans tunnel just in case there's any issues with the drive shaft and starts whipping around in there. You don't want to lose the brakes too. Alright, so that's it for this one, guys. Subscribe, check out the build. If you guys really hate this stuff and you don't like it at all, send it to your worst enemy and make them watch it. So I got some parts rolling in already for this thing. I got like parts for the hot side, cold side, exhaust manifold, gaskets and bolts, subframe connectors, catch can, all kinds of stuff. So Hunter from Hunter Tuned is providing the wastegates and the fuel line. All kinds of stuff starting to roll in already. So thanks for watching. Have a good one.